All right, hey guys, my name is Ace Reddy. Welcome to the Ace Reddy Show. As narcissistic as it sounds to name a show after myself, I mean, that's kind of what you do. We have Robert Greene on the podcast. I'm super excited for this. The first time I read his book, it was The 48 Laws of Power, which was about 6 years ago. And I've been reading this book every month, right? And one of my favorite things to do is, especially with the book, The Art of Seduction, is that I had no charisma as a kid, like zero charisma. I was never the popular guy. No one respected me, nothing. And I also had a lot of anger issues and whatnot. So I was very reactive. So if someone would like blame me for something or whatever, so I'd be very reactive to it. The thing that cured that for me, honestly, was I picked this one audio from the book, The Art of Seduction. It's called The Charmer. And I would listen to that again and again and again and again. I don't know. It just transformed my mind, and suddenly I was just more charismatic, and I have all these followers now. I have like 100K followers on Instagram, all these places, tons of fans and stuff. I got to credit that to Robert. So we have him on the podcast. Really excited to have you on. Thanks for
Well,
jumping
thank you
on,
for
bro.
ha- well, thank you for having me, Ace. My pleasure.
Awesome. So, I asked Robert if there's any question he didn't want me to ask. He said, if there is something, he'll tell me, but he's pretty open to it all. So let's get
Yeah,
into the first question, right?
sure.
How did you decide to become an author? And more specifically, right? Because I wouldn't even say your books are not just a normal book. Your books are more of life manuals, right? So they're like, you could use that to live. I mean, it's the rules of life. And you have such a huge following, all the way from Hollywood celebrities to rappers to everybody all over the world. How did you decide to become an author that writes such material?
Well, as usual with most things in life, it's a combination of some planning and a lot of luck, kind of fall into things. So I had been writing for many years. I mean, I started working on the 48 Laws of Power basically when I was about 35, 36. And prior to that, I'd been writing many different things. Tried to write novels. As a journalist. I worked in Hollywood as a screenwriter, and nothing quite clicked. It wasn't a good match for me. I have a peculiar mind, and it wasn't fitting into any of those media. So I was kind of at the time that before the 48 Laws of Power, I was sort of lost and a little bit depressed. And I met a man named Joost Delfers who was a book packager. We were in Italy at the time, and he asked me if I had any ideas for books. And I gave him a couple of ideas, but the one he liked the most was this idea that I had about power. And basically, I said I had had so many different jobs, particularly in Hollywood, but everywhere in the world, because I traveled and I lived in Europe for many years. And I also read a lot of history. And what I read of history in the Renaissance and Machiavelli and ancient China and ancient Greece, it's all the same. The stories that I saw in offices in the United States or in Europe were just the same kind of patterns or paradigms as I was reading in history. And I gave him an example. The example was the story of Louis XIV and his finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, who threw a very lavish party in honor of the king in order to ingratiate himself. But the party was so successful and everyone so admired Nicolas Fouquet that it made the king feel insecure. And the next day he had Nicolas Fouquet thrown in prison for the rest of his life. And the guy I told the story to, Joost, he said, "That's fantastic. That's a great idea for a book." And so that ended up being the first story in the 48 Laws of Power, Never Outshine the Master. So the planning element was I've been writing my whole life. I've been absorbing a lot of experiences. I've been reading a lot of history. But the luck element was meeting this man and him kind of getting excited by this idea. And then as I started working on the book, it just sort of all of my weirdness, all of my strangeness, because I have a strange mind, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's for worse, but I have a strange mind. And all of my weird ways of thinking, using stories to illustrate them, putting the materials on the side to illustrate the ideas, having an image that encapsulates the story and putting the image in a form, and on and on and on. That kind of reflects how I feel, how I think, how I look at the world. So since that book was the first one, it kind of set the tone for everything else that happened in my life. So I saw that my strangeness could actually communicate to people, and some people would like it, including yourself. And then I realized, well, I can continue like this. I can be myself. I can be as weird and out there as I want, and people respond to it. So that was sort of how I came to writing these books.
That's awesome. I'm glad you did. You're really impacting a lot of people here. My second question is, I've read the Laws of Power. I think I know most of them by heart. And I want to know what your three favorite laws of power are. What if you had to pick just three out of the whole book, what would they be? And why?
Well, that's a great question. I know one of my favorites is despise the free lunch, because I'm always telling that to people. You know, I'm always saying if something is free, you should be very wary and suspicious. It's always better to pay for things and pay well if you can. And it's always good to be generous to people, to pay your employees well, to treat them well. Generosity has an incredibly powerful seductive effect on people. So I've always liked that law. And sometimes I violate that law. I go, oh God, I really need to listen. I really need to read my own book sometimes, you know?
Right.
And then I really like the law, assume formlessness, because my whole philosophy, I'm very much influenced by Asian philosophy and Asian forms of strategy, particularly Sun Tzu, but also I really love Japanese strategy thinking, strategic thinking like Musashi and samurai philosophy. And in their idea, the idea of formlessness is extremely important, where your ideas and your strategies and your attitudes toward life are like water. You're flowing with events. You never repeat the same thing twice. You're open constantly to trying out new things. You don't repeat the same strategies over and over and over again. And to put that as the 48th law is a bit ironic, because in that chapter I'm telling readers, don't follow me too closely. Don't just imitate the 48 laws of power. Think for yourself. Be formless, right? Just don't be an imitator of the ideas of Robert Greene. So that was sort of my last chapter. Then the other one I kind of use a lot is make others come to you. I don't like it when I have to push myself on other people, when I have to always be asking them to interview me or asking them for money. I hated that position. To me, power is when you're in such a solid place that other people come to you. And sometimes you can make other people come to you by being a little bit withdrawn, by not being so overt, by taking a step back and creating some mystery, and then people come to you. I find that an extremely powerful law.
Awesome. So your three favorite laws are assume formlessness. Try to remember here again. Make them come to you. And the first one is
despise the free lunch.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. I've always used that law, honestly, because I feel like every time there is a free lunch, even if they don't ask you for something, say you want to do something to them, and when they ask you to do it, you can't say no anymore. So you're in a uncomfortable position there. So
exactly.
So this is another question that I have for you, which is, who were the three historical figures that inspire you the most, and why?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly, you know, Machiavelli has to be probably number one because he had such an impact on my writing. I really identify with Machiavelli, his way of thinking. He's very strategic. He's very realistic and practical. He's always analyzing what's really going on as opposed to what appears to be going on. But he's also a product of the Renaissance. So he was a poet. He was a great seducer. He was just an overall Renaissance type ideal person. And I just really identified with him. I really, really loved his style of writing. And so he would have to be probably number one. Strangely, number two would have to be Buddha, because I've been extremely involved and excited by Zen Buddhism for maybe, well, since I first got my book called the Zen Mumon Khan's Comments on Zen Koans back in the late 70s. I'm that old. But more recently, the last 20 years, I've been delving very deeply into it. And just the figure and the story of Buddha fascinates me. Much more than any other religious figure. I've devoured books on his life, and in my next book, I'm going to be talking a little bit. Certain episodes in his life fascinate me. And then, Napoleon Bonaparte, because he was, I know that's a very strange combination, Machiavelli, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Buddha. That's probably the weirdest trio of anybody, but it's true. Napoleon, because he was such a great strategist, and his story is so dramatic, coming from nowhere. He wasn't from poverty, but he basically raised himself up from nothing. He wasn't in the aristocracy. He did it all on his own. He was absolutely the greatest war strategist, I believe, that ever lived. I mean, you could also include Genghis Khan there, and perhaps Hannibal. But I consider Napoleon the great genius of warfare. And of course, he had 10 years of incredible strategic wisdom, and then 10 years where it fell apart because he was human and is flawed and his power went to his head. But his story and his creativity and his open mind, speaking of assumed formlessness, he was the great genius of that. Those would probably be the three figures I would choose.
Awesome. Yeah. The next question is, I actually want to dissect into one law that you said was the one that interests you the most. It's the one you started off the book with. That is, never outshine the master, right? And this is something I've been doing for the last 6 years. Because I mean, if I have, like, I do a bunch of coaching stuff too. I have coaches, I have mentors. Everyone has mentors. At what point do you think one should start to outshine the master? I mean, I did read in the book that if he can double or triple whatever he's doing, that's when you start outshining the master. But for a person that's starting out and he has all this potential, at what point does he start making moves that could outshine the master? I mean, what's the logic there is what I'm trying to see.
Well, I talked about assumed formlessness. When it comes to thinking about your life and particular circumstances and your strategies, you have to think about your particular circumstances. Every circumstance is different. So if you're working in a company, 50 people, 100 people, there's all kinds of office politics going on, and you have a boss and you're just starting out, you have to be very, very careful and not ever violate this law, which I personally have violated on several occasions, because you'll end up being fired and no one will ever tell you why. And it'll create kind of emotional trauma in your life that you'll carry with you for years. You need to impress people by how hard you're willing to work, how you're a team player, okay? Because one thing you have to realize is, in a work environment, the people above you, your boss and the other people above you, they have egos, right? You always assume that the boss is so powerful that he or she doesn't really care about what you're doing, or doesn't even worry about you might be after their job or that you're better than they are. But you never assume that. The people above you are riddled with insecurities. The higher you climb up in the world, the more insecure you become, and your ego can be very fragile. So you initially want to give people the comforting feeling that you're just there to work for them, that you're there to do everything they need, that you're a company person, you're a team player. And then slowly, as you feel the situation out, as you accumulate allies, as you accumulate skills and experiences, and you make one law very, very important that we haven't talked about, which is make people dependent on you. I can't remember what number. I think it's like number 11 or 12.
Right.
Very, very important. So that you've created, if people need you there in the company, now you have leverage to perhaps make some moves where you can start shining a little bit more and more and more. Now, if you're in a company of just 2 or 3 people, it's a startup, for instance, you don't really have a boss, so there's just one boss, then it's a little looser. You can play the game a little bit differently. Perhaps you can start proving yourself earlier on because there's not so much politics going on, right? And then if you're in a situation with a mentor or a coach, that's very different. That's not a boss. That's someone there who's there to teach you. And I talk in chapter 3 of Mastery, which is, I go into very great detail about the student master relationship, the apprentice and the master, and how at the beginning you must be very respectful. You must choose the right mentor. You're very respectful. You're learning, and that at some point your goal is to surpass that master, right? So you need, first of all, to be aware of what kind of a person you're apprenticing to. Is it someone who's very insecure? Then you need to be careful. But I take the point in Mastery that that is not a good mentor for you. Somebody who's very insecure, has a fragile ego, is worried about you, and your relationship is a little bit like that. That's not a good mentor. But eventually your goal is to surpass that master. And they have a saying in Spanish, I can't remember I can't repeat it, but basically the best student is the one who is able to knife the master. In other words, it's like a sword fighter, and you're the apprentice sword fighter, and your goal is eventually to be able to actually kill that master with your sword. You get so good, but you have to wait to the right moment. So it depends on your circumstance. People are generally bad strategists in life. I don't make that as a criticism. That's why they like my books. And why people are bad strategists is they don't think about their circumstances. They don't think about what is different in each situation. So it's like, it's not never outshine the master, no matter where you are, no matter what you do. It's look at the situation you're in, look at your master, look at the boss, and sense their insecurities. And when the moment is ripe for you to start proving yourself, showing off a little bit. So that's sort of, I can't remember what your question was, but that's sort of my answer. I hope I answered it.
That definitely answers it. The next question I have is, you've written a book on power, you've written a book on war, you've written a book on mastery too. Why seduction? What made you gravitate towards writing a book on seduction?
Well, so in the 48 Laws of Power, I have a lot of stories about seduction. You know, I have a story of a courtesan. I have a story of Ninon de l'Enclos. I have stories about using mystery to creating an air of mystery, which is the ultimate seduction. I have used absence to create honor and respect, and I have a story of a seduction in there. I have stories of courtesans, etc. So already the theme was in there. And my idea of seduction in writing the 48 Laws of Power was that it's the ultimate form of power. So when you make the other person, when you give them kind of pleasure, when you create a pleasant environment, when you make the situation such that they like you, then you have incredible power and room to move, maneuverability, right? You have incredible capacity to influence them, to move them in your direction. It's the soft form of power. It's what Napoleon called having an iron fist inside of a velvet glove. So they feel your velvet glove. It's soft and plush and nice, but inside, just ignore that. Inside, you're pushing them around. You have the power. So, and then the other thing is, when I was a young man in my 20s, early 20s, I lived in Paris. I was 21. I was working in a hotel, and it's a hotel that's still there. It's not the same owner, but it was a hotel where all the models stayed for the fashion shows, right? All these incredibly beautiful women. And I was always interested in seduction, in the literature of seduction, and great novels about seduction. But then I met particularly this one guy who was an incredible seducer. His name was Eduardo. He was Brazilian. He was just unbelievably successful with women, and I couldn't understand why. I sort of watched him, and I kind of learned lessons from him. And the main lesson I learned from Eduardo was, what's the most seductive single quality you can have? It's not being defensive at all. Non-defensiveness. Nothing bothers you. Nothing irritates you. You never get defensive or feel bad or make the other person feel guilty. It's just incredibly powerful. So having that experience in the back of my mind, having the books that I read, I've always been interested in this form of power. So it seemed like the natural book to write as my second book.
Awesome. So Eduardo's the charmer. That's who you're talking about in the chapter, the charmer, I guess.
He was a total rake. Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a rake. But yeah, he was also very charming. Right.
Oh,
Not being defensive is one of the qualities of the charmer. You're right. But he had other skills as well.
awesome. Gotcha. The next question I have is for anyone that's maybe younger or even older, guys going to networking summits, or if they're in a group in general. And this is something that people ask me a lot, so I wanted to see what you want, like, what your views are on it. How do you assert yourself in a group where nobody knows you? So if you're entering and nobody in the group knows you, and you're trying to either be popular or trying to be an authority figure, how would you assert yourself?
Well, once again, it depends on what the group is, who you are, who the top players are. So you have to be aware. I make a very big point in Mastery. I really advise people to read Mastery. Is the most important skill you have in the work world is your ability to observe people, to observe the dynamic. I talk also in Laws of Human Nature about group dynamics. So you're very aware, you're very attuned to what's going on in the group, so that you realize in some groups, in some networks, being assertive is the right attitude. People will respect that. In other groups, being assertive, you will look like an asshole and nobody will want to talk to you and they'll push you aside. So you have to tailor your attitude and your mentality to the group dynamic. The one thing, though, to always keep in mind is just being someone who brags a lot and talks a lot about yourself is a very negative quality. It shows weakness. So if you're trying to assert and say, look, I got great ideas, I'm the one that you really need to listen to here. However you say that, it comes across in the end. People smell it as insecurity. You need to push yourself. You have to prove yourself because you don't feel very secure about who you are. So avoid the temptation of talking about yourself and how great you are and your great qualities, how I'm such a great listener, how I do this, that, and the other. It doesn't work, right? You want to show your qualities. You don't want to tell them. You want to show that you're smart. You want to show people that you're confident and that you're powerful. What is a quality that radiates confidence? Because that will get you the most movement in a group situation. The person who looks like they're destined for something great, that has, a sense of destiny and fate behind them, that's very, very powerful. Well, as I talk about in all of my books, don't talk too much. Don't be the kind of person that just blabs and blabs and blabs, right? Be strategic when you say something. Also, having a kind of authoritative body language. Be aware of your nonverbal communication. So try and be someone who radiates confidence and self-security. And in my book, in Laws of Human Nature, I have a chapter on what kind of nonverbal qualities actually radiate confidence, right? But the single greatest thing you can do is come back to make people dependent on you. You have knowledge, you have a skill that everybody needs, everybody wants. You have experience that is in demand, right? And you make it somehow clear in this networking group by what you say, by what you indicate, that you have some kind of special knowledge. You have special knowledge about trends, about where the world is headed in 5 or 10 years. And based on experience, based on real skill, not just based on bullshit, right? You actually have these qualities. And so if you can give people that impression, then they go, wow, I need to listen to him. I need to know something more. But that is something that you have to be prepared your whole life for. You have to be someone who actually has real important knowledge and real important skills. So one last thing I will say is, when you're in your networking group, think of what is it that will impress people? What is it that people want the most? What is the skill or piece of knowledge that is actually not there that people need to know, right? And one thing that I find always valuable is to have a knowledge about where the world is headed in this particular field. To be saying, in 2 years, this kind of business is going to be incredibly in demand. For instance, this is an idea of mine, this experience-based businesses where you're giving people a certain experience. And that can be like Burning Man, or that can be a particular store where it's not just something you're selling, but you're selling an experience. Particularly after this pandemic, is going to be a really popular form of business. It's like a new form that's exploding since the 90s, but it's now really popular. If you can come in with some sense of this is where things are headed in our field, people will listen to you. So do your research. That's it. That's my answer.
Awesome. That does answer the question. Thank you, Robert. The next one is, how does it feel knowing that you've impacted so many lives? Like, I mean, you've helped me a lot. I was literally, I mean, I wouldn't even know what would happen to my life if it wasn't for your work. So how does it feel knowing that you've impacted so many lives all across the world?
Well, it's a bit humbling and it's very gratifying. You know, I'm not somebody who really, I'm not a celebrity type person. I'm not heavily into popular culture, although I do like rap music. And I know, I did a book with 50 Cent, but I prefer hearing from people like you or just people who aren't yet famous, because you're going to be famous someday, who have stories like this, because it makes me feel like, if you're already famous, you don't really necessarily totally need a book like mine. But to hear stories of people who start from a position of not having much power and the book really helped them, that's the most gratifying thing. That's what really helps me stay alive and makes me feel motivated to write my next book. Because, a lot of writers write books. I hope this doesn't sound, egotistical, but a
You
lot of writers
all
write
right?
books
Yes, that's
just
okay.
to a lot of okay, a lot of people write books just because they like the sound of their own voice and they think they're so clever and they think they have a great idea. And I like to write books that are actually going to change people. I'm a very practical person. I don't want to write book just to impress you with my language or my words or to seem clever or witty. I want to like get inside your brain and I want to literally change how you look at the world. I literally want to alter how you look at people, how you look at yourself, how you look at the world in general. From the inside, it's like I think of my books almost like a poison or something or alcohol. It's going to enter you into your bloodstream. And it's going to affect your brain. And I consciously want my books to do that. So to hear from people that it has altered the way they think, that gives me a sense that my strategic way of thinking of doing that, because I'm very conscious of trying that in my books, is actually working. So it's incredibly gratifying to hear that.
That's awesome. Would you say that this was your greater purpose in life? Would you say that? I mean, you got lucky meeting the publisher of the book, and looking back at it, would you say that you were always meant to be Robert Greene and have books that would really impact people? Would that be your greater purpose of life?
I suppose you could say that. I mean, I'm a big believer in thinking that way because it makes your life seem like it had direction and that everything happened for a purpose. So you don't need to regret anything. So certainly back in the early 90s, I was kind of depressed and I didn't know where I was going and I was a little bit worried about myself. So it's not completely like, oh, I always knew this is exactly what I wanted to do. But the one thing is, at my worst moments, I never gave up. I always had the idea that I could write and that I could write something meaningful, whatever form that was. And I kept trying and trying and trying. And every time I failed, I picked myself back up and I tried something else. So, in that sense, there was a kind of purpose and a kind of direction to what I was doing in life. And so, one time my girlfriend and I counted that over my life, I had like 50, 60 different jobs. I never had one job for more than 11 months. And it was that kind of career thing that made it seem like I was unstable. But I can say this in retrospect, in having these different jobs, and I mean, I worked as a tour guide, I did construction work, I worked in a detective agency, I worked on the first online encyclopedia. I mean, on and on and on, jobs that had no relationship to each other, so vast and different. But I saw so many different kinds of bosses, so many different kinds of power situations, so many different kinds of strategic dynamics going on, that it gave me all of this material to write my books. So in some ways, in retrospect, it looks like everything in my life had a purpose and a direction for it. So yeah.
That's awesome. So everything does happen for a reason. If you guys are watching this and you're going through any struggle whatsoever, know that everything's going to be fine one day, and then you can look back on it and you start to realize what the greater meaning of that was. So,
Well, I would qualify that just a little bit. It will only work if you have an overall idea about what you want in life. So that's what in Mastery, in the first chapter, that's probably the most important chapter in any of my books for people who are just starting their career, is discovering what you really meant to do in life, what makes you unique, what makes you different, what excites you. Because if you're not excited by your work, you won't be creative, you won't have energy, you'll get burned out. So it's okay to wander, it's okay to have failure. It's actually, failure is a great thing. It's also fine to feel a little bit lost, but in a general sense, you know what you meant to do. And I mean by that, like for me, it was writing, right? It had to be that. So if I was in my 20s and 30s and I thought, I could be a writer, I could be a doctor, I could be a veterinarian, I could be a lawyer, then my life would have no direction and I wouldn't be here talking to you. So you have to have some overall something that kind of focuses your energy. And then your failures and your mistakes, they don't drag you down. You can surmount them because you know that eventually you'll figure it out. So yeah, that's the only way I would qualify that a little bit.
that's awesome. That's a good point. My next question is, what was it like to write a book with 50 Cent? You wrote a book with him, and everyone sees him as a rapper, and everyone loves him. And I just want to know, what was it like to write a book with him?
It was a great experience. One of the reasons I did it was prior to that, my first three books, I really enjoyed writing them, but honestly, they were all about dead people, right? It's just me sitting in my room, my office, reading books, compiling note cards, and then writing about people that are just in my head. They're all dead, right? And so I was kind of craving something different at that time. And so I was invited to meet 50 because he's a big fan of the 48 Laws. And we clicked. We had some kind of similar way of looking at the world, of analyzing power, analyzing. He was going through a lot of beefs at the time, like with Game, the rapper Game, and his way of thinking about it was very strategic. And I liked it. We sort of clicked on that level. And so we weren't originally thinking about writing a book. And then I went away thinking, well, this guy is really smart. He's very clever. And he came from the absolute worst circumstances you can have. His mother died when he was 9 years old. I think 9, maybe even younger. He was hustling on the streets, basically at that age. And all of his friends were being killed. And he's raised by his grandparents in a very dangerous part of New York. And yet, look at where he was. It was an amazing story. And I had this idea that this guy is kind of like Napoleon Bonaparte in a way. He raised himself up from nowhere, dealing with a very Machiavellian world, the music industry, which traditionally is one of the worst environments that exploits Black artists in the worst possible way. So I admired how far he had come from against such odds. And so I thought, what if we could put our two minds together and write a book? And he was excited by it. And so I spent 6 months with him, pretty much 6 months. I followed him everywhere. I went to his award ceremonies in Vegas. I went to his house in Connecticut. I hung out with him in New York, all of his business ventures. And he's actually a really nice guy. I mean, I saw moments where I could see that he could be tough and I wouldn't want to cross him,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't want to mess with 50. But in general, he's not a thug at all. He's very charming. He's an incredible seducer. I heard him on the phone talking to several very famous female rappers, and he was just like honey. He was just pouring, he was just a great talker. He's very
Mm-hmm.
seductive. And at one point, we had a book signing here in Los Angeles, and my mother, who now is in her early 90s, but was in her 80s then, who doesn't even couldn't tell you one rapper from another. She thought, God, he's really charming. I really like him. If he could charm my 80-something-year-old mother, then this guy has real charisma. So it was a great experience for me. It really opened me up to that world that has embraced me in so many ways. And I learned a lot from them. I learned what it really means to be fearless in life and how maybe I'm not as courageous as 50 and I could learn from him. It was a great moment for me.
Awesome. So I'm curious, what seductive character types would 50 Cent fall into?
Well, he certainly has the quality of the rake. He's very good with words. He's extremely interested in women. He's also got tremendous amount of charisma. I would put those two qualities on top. Um, and his, in the book on charismatics, I describe how oftentimes people who come from broken homes or who come from a family where they didn't receive a lot of love, they become the most charismatic of all because they need to get that kind of love and attention from a group, from an audience, as a performer or as a politician. And their need for attention and love from others just radiates out of them. And he has that tremendous charismatic quality. So in general, as a performer, I would call him the charismatic. And as a man seducing women, I would say he's a rake.
Gotcha. Awesome. Lots of rakes there. Lots of rakes. So we got Eduardo, then we have 50 Cent as well being a rake. Uh, so the next question would be, and this is something people ask me a lot because I run the Books with Robert Greene group, and there's a lot of people messaging me. Do you do any private coaching, consulting at all? If people want to reach out to you, want to get some direct advice straight from Robert Greene?
Yeah, I do, but I've really curtailed it because as you know, I've had some health issues, and probably the stress of writing The Laws of Human Nature and doing my consulting work and everything else probably led partially to my stroke. I was doing too much. So I have to be careful because I now have a television production for the 48 Laws, which is still in very preliminary phase. And I'm writing a new book, which is taking a lot of my time and my energy. I do 2 hours of physical therapy every day. And then I still do my consulting work, but I've had to really curtail it because it's just too much. I'm overwhelmed. I'm also doing interviews. So sometimes, like if people have a very interesting situation, I'll take them on in as a consultant. But generally, look, think of it this way. Do you want me to write more books? If you want me to write more books, then have a little compassion for my health and my energy. And that if I can't help you right now with your problem, it's because I'm trying to really write my next book. But I encourage people to write me at the my address is available on my website. But don't be offended if I don't respond right away. Okay. So I do consulting, but I've had to curtail it since my stroke almost 2 years ago.
How's your health doing? I know we spoke about that before the call, but a lot of people want to know about how's your health doing, and so.
Well, my health is fine, really. I mean, I've got physically I feel fine, but to be honest with you, so it affected the left side of my body. It was the right side of my brain that I had a blood clot, and the damage was to my right side of my brain, which is very lucky because if it's the left side of your brain, you tend to lose cognitive ability and language. I wouldn't have been able to write another book. So I'm very fortunate that it didn't damage my cognitive abilities as far as I can tell. But it did the left side of my body. And I thought by now, I'm 21 months later, I thought by now I'd be going back to my old life of hiking and swimming and bicycling. But no, it's been extremely slow. So I still have to walk with a cane. I still don't walk very well. I have to wear a brace. I still can't type with two hands. I can only type with one hand. So it's very frustrating, to be honest with you, because I like to be physically active. It's been a real challenge for me. So health-wise, I think I'm fine. A little bit stressed, but I think I can handle that. It's just the getting my arm and leg back is taking much longer than I anticipated.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I actually admire about you, because when we jumped on the call to check if the tech was okay, you actually told me you came back from a bike ride. And I'm like, that's awesome, right? But I mean, you're at least doing something. You're keeping your body active, because a lot of people take having, health issues as well. Your health is fine, but having any issues as an excuse to not do any physical activity, right? They just want to stay home and they don't want to work. They don't want to do anything. And you're still out there pushing, and you're already Robert Greene. You have 4 or 5, maybe 6 books, bestsellers. You pretty much, like, you have the fame and you have all of that, but you're still out there pushing, and you're still out there trying to write another book. And that's just something I admire about you, actually, a lot. So,
thank you. Yeah, I mean, at some point I'm going to need to rest because I'm not getting any younger. So after this next book, I promised myself and my family that I'm going to take it a little bit slow for a year and relax and recover, because probably working on another book and trying so hard is affecting my recovery physically. It'd be better sometimes if I could relax, but I'm somebody that's very intense and I love writing books. So there's a good and there's a bad side to that.
awesome. So that brings me to the next question. Can you give us a sneak peek of what your next book is about?
It's a very hard book to describe verbally. I'm not the best person describing my own books. I'm better at writing them, but essentially it's called The Law of the Sublime. And it's a book about the sublime, and it's a particular theory of mine. And my theory is that being a human being, as we are today and as we've been for thousands of years, we have certain limits that we create. I like to think of it as a circle. And this circle is the limiting factor about what we think and how we behave. And so socially, we have conventions. This is what you must do. This is how you must fit into the group. And this affects how we think. This is how we have to think about the world. This is how we have to think about politics. This is how we have to think about work and the economy and our careers, etc. And this circle that we live in is actually very oppressive for a human being, because our minds are extremely active. We're a species that thrives on solving problems and going out there and being active and getting things done and creating and building. And so living in a world where everything is sort of limited, I think is very oppressive. And it's what makes people turn to drugs, turn to various forms of addiction on the internet or whatever. It makes them try all kinds of weird cults and things. They're looking for something outside that circle. And so my idea is what's just outside that circle is the sublime. So when you try something that goes outside the limits of what you're supposed to do, when you think in your art form, you think of a different way of creating a genre, or when you think in politics of a different kind of way of organizing people, or you think of a business that no one has ever thought of, or you go do mountain climbing and you push yourself beyond what you've ever done before, and you explore that realm beyond those limits, suddenly you change psychologically. Your eyes are open. You see It's a religious experience. This is a book that's slightly spiritual in that sense. It's almost religious. It's like you're suddenly aware that the world is quite awesome and great, and that that little prison that you've been living in is in your own mind, and you can break out of it. And when you do that, when you experience it, it's incredibly invigorating. And so the ultimate limit to our life, if you think of that circle, is death, because that is the limit of how long we can live, obviously. And so death is kind of, if you can actually look beyond your fear of death and actually contemplate it, which is subject of chapter 18 in the Laws of Human Nature, if you can actually come to terms with your own mortality, you're going beyond the ultimate limit of them all, your fear of death. And when you do that, that is the ultimate sublime experience. And I myself, so that was chapter 18 of the Laws of Human Nature, which I finished in May of 2018. 2 months later, I came this close to dying myself. I was in a coma. I was unconscious. If my girlfriend hadn't called, if I had been alone, I'd be dead right now, because I'm often alone. If she hadn't called the ambulance right away, I'd have severe brain damage. There'd be no more books, etc. But basically, I had a very close encounter with death. And it's an awesome experience, actually. It's not what you think it is. So that's what the subject of this book is in various facets. And one of the themes in the book is I'm very fascinated with science and discoveries in neuroscience, in physics, in biology, in animal science, because I find them extremely sublime ideas, because they're actually making us aware of the awesomeness of the universe, of how strange it is that that I'm talking to Ace Reddy right now on Zoom, compared to 30,000 years ago where our ancestors were. It's mind-blowing. And so to study how the brain evolved, to study our place in the chain of life in biology, is to me incredibly sublime subject. So that's to give you an idea of the book.
That was the perfect description of the book. I was like, I will wait to buy it. Thank you. Now I'm growing impatient. When is the book going to come out?
Well, I'm just finishing up the research in a month or two, and then I'm going to start writing. Probably in about 3 years, I'm afraid.
Dang, yeah. Now I'm gonna. Dang, yeah. I would love a sneak peek. So if you ever want to send me something that you're working on, want me to take a look at it, I'd love to.
I might try and share some of it with my readers. I'll see.
Awesome. So, well, I mean, that brings me to my next question. What part of the writing a book deal do you love the most? Do you love the research? Do you love actually writing the book? Do you love what is the most what is the greatest experience for you about writing a book like that?
Well, the research is probably the most fun, because at that point there's no pressure on me. I'm just reading and I'm enjoying it, and I take note cards on it, just sort of what I am right now. But I'm kind of finishing that up. The writing part is actually very hard and very painful and very stressful. It has moments of tremendous satisfaction when you feel like you've done a good chapter or the right idea. But it's very painful and very difficult. And it's probably, what kind of can ruin my health sometimes, because I'm very intense about it. So I'd have to say that the research is like, if this is your normal mood, and this is kind of like ecstasy, the research is kind of up and down, but sort of more in the middle area. The writing is kind of like, so it has highs and lows that the research doesn't have, mostly lows, but the highs are I don't get that kind of high from the research, because when you're writing and it's clicking, you feel great, but most often you feel like, damn, this isn't working. Damn, I don't know what I'm doing. Damn, this book sucks. So, that's sort of how I would answer that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I always felt that the research process is going to be fun because you get to study so many historic things, and now yeah, you're not just studying it just to study it, but you can turn it into a book, and you're actually contributing value to the world by actually reading something. So I think that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, the next question that I actually have for you is, who are some of the major celebrities that have read and loved your books so far?
Well, 50 Cent, Kanye West, Jay-Z, just to stick to the rap world. Busta Rhymes, who's a big one. Drake. So all those people, and then there are a few others. And I think Bob Dylan supposedly is it the 48 Laws of Power. And there have been some actors. I know Will Smith is a big fan, and his wife Jada. And I know some film directors like Phil Berg are big fans. Um, I know there are a few other actors that I'm missing here. I know that Fidel Castro had read the 48 Laws of Power before he passed away. Um, there was a former president of Guatemala who was a big fan. I know there are people I can't mention their names, but were very powerful political figures in the Middle East. There are people in Russian politics. Um, there's some business people like Peter Thiel, who's a very famous entrepreneur, and Reid Hoffman, who started, what is it, Netflix? Excuse me if I got that wrong. I think that's it. Um, so those would be a smattering of the people that I would mention. I'm sure I'm missing. Oh, then there are athletes. You know, I know LeBron James has my book because we sent it to him, and Carmelo Anthony is a big fan. So the various American athletes and even some soccer players. So that'd be kind of the range of things. I know I'm leaving somebody out, but that's sort of it.
That's awesome. You got the whole world reading your books. It's pretty awesome. So the next
And Ace Reddy.
thank you for that. That really makes me feel good. Thank you for. I'm gonna take that clip, put it on my YouTube channel. Probably look back at it 20 years later. It's gonna be fun. A friend of mine on Twitter called Soul Bra. That's his Twitter name. It's Soul Bra. He just asked me a question. He asked me to ask you this question, which is how to determine the difference between a fruitless endeavor or merely hitting a brick wall that, if persevered through, will lead to more success. Essentially,
Okay.
I think his question is, how do you
Well,
differentiate between something that's actually part of your greater purpose in life and something that isn't? And it just is
I want you to change your attitude. What's his name? Soulbra?
soul bra. Yeah.
Soulbra. Change your attitude and see that there's no such thing as a brick wall. So
Mhm.
let's say you've got a terrible, terrible job at Starbucks or serving pizza, and you hate it, and it's going nowhere. Well, there's a way of thinking about this job. So this is what I talk about when Ryan Holiday asked me about the difference between alive time and dead time, and how I want you to create alive time. It's how you look at it. If you look at it well, in this bad experience, in this hitting a brick wall, I'm learning what I hate. I'm learning what I'm not good at. I'm learning what I should never ever do again in my life. I'm learning that I've got to get some real skills. I've got to go to night school. I got to get some knowledge so that I don't have to work at this pizza parlor or this bar or whatever ever again. So you're learning that. You're also learning about bosses that you hate. This is a boss I hate how he treats me. All right. You're learning how you never ever want to treat other people later. You're learning what makes a good boss and a bad boss. You're observing your people working with you, who's smart, who's stupid, who's irritating, who's charming. You're looking at customers and people. What makes a customer like a polite customer? What learning about human psychology. So even in your worst fucking job, even the worst position you can be in, you have a million opportunities to learn from it, about yourself, about what you dislike, about psychology, about the bad people out there, the toxic people, about the few good people. They're not few, but how there's the good people out there, etc. you're learning mostly about what you like and what you hate. So there's never anything as a brick wall. But the other thing is you want to choose a career path that excites you, that you have some kind of personal connection to, right? So if you figure that out and you try it out, let's say it's music and your music fails, well, that's a different kind of failure than working at the pizza joint that you hate. At least this is in the direction of something that you love. So what you learn from that bad experience is of a slightly higher quality because you learn what will make a successful second try. You learn how to toughen yourself up, how to accept criticism, how to accept failure. So there are two different scenarios. One is hitting that brick wall, it's something that you hate, has nothing to do with your career, and having a mistake or a failure in something that you love. Both you're going to learn from, but the lessons are slightly different. But I want you to alter your attitude. There is no such thing as a bad experience. You're learning from everything that happens to you. Soul bra.
That's an awesome answer. I do have a personal question for you. I'm super ADD. I'm super ADHD. Half the time I'm doing these podcasts, I cannot pay attention to the person, right? I'm just like, I'm in 17 different places. Were you always a great communicator in a sense that you could get people to just start listening to you? Because I'm hooked. When you talk, I'm hooked. Like I'm dead. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to answer that question. Mostly, now, before I wrote the books, nobody would listen, give me, 2 minutes of their time because I was a nobody. But now that I've read the books, everybody thinks that I'm wise and smart. But I've also learned a lot in the 20 some years since the books have come out. I have a lot of experience. I've read a lot. I've thought a lot. So I have things to say. But in general, because of who I am and because I'm a writer, I've always been a good listener. I've always tried to listen to people and kind of absorb their energy and kind of see what they need and what they're thinking about and paying them a lot of attention. So if someone's interviewing me, I try to, in a nonverbal way, try to figure out what they're like and what they're after and why they're asking that question and, what's behind it and what their audience is. And, maybe that over the years, it's turned into something of a skill.
So you're an analyst on me. That's interesting. So you probably know a lot about me there. You've been observing my body language, Robert?
Well, a little bit unconsciously. I'm not taking notes or anything. You can relax.
Yeah, okay. That's awesome. So that kind of the last question actually. So you have a Netflix series coming out on your book, which you spoke about earlier. How did that even happen? Did Drake call you? Did his team call you?
Well, it's actually not Netflix, it's Quibi,
Oh
which is
yeah.
a new platform. It's designed actually to see things on your phone. Yeah, I met with Drake about 2, 3 years ago. Like 50, he wanted to meet me. He was a big fan of the 48 Laws. We met at this kind of club, a bar in Los Angeles, and it was sort of an interview that he recorded, and we had a really good rapport, kind of like with 50. And I really understand people like him because, he's a actually very sensitive guy, more sensitive than you think. And he deals, because, he's an actor, he comes from a different background. He's half black and he's actually half Jewish, which is very interesting because I'm Jewish. So we were both kind of talking about our bar mitzvahs that we both had, etc. So he's not a typical rapper. He's a very sensitive guy, very emotional, and he's dealt with a lot of criticism and a lot of, setbacks and people being kind of mean-spirited towards him. And then he's dealt with a lot of really nasty people in the music industry. So I really had compassion and empathy for him. And I admire, once again, how far he's come. Because, rap world is a world where most people have success for a year or two. To stay on top in rap, particularly now, where no one is really very famous anymore. It's not like the heyday in the 90s with Tupac or the early 2000s with Jay-Z and 50. There are no really huge celebrity rappers as much as there was in the past. That's good and bad. But anyway, to stay on top of the rapper like he has for some 8 or 9 years is actually an incredible feat. It means he's very smart and very strategic. So we hit it off, and they had the idea of maybe trying to do 48 Laws as a television series, and we've been discussing it for a couple of years now. And finally, we sold the idea to Quibi, to this new company, and we're going to try and recreate the spirit of the book in a visual realm. What that means, I can't really tell you because I actually don't really know yet. We're working on it. But each chapter, each episode would be a law of power, and the stories would be different. Some would be stories from the book, some would be stories from the news right now, but that illustrate never outshine the master, whatever that might be. So you're going to see the episode and you're going to learn a little bit about the power situation. So it's going to be both entertaining and educational. That's about as much as I can say about the series.
That's awesome. So that was my last question. I know you said you only had an hour for the interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're 3 minutes after that, I guess. So thanks for this interview, Robert. I learned a lot. I'm sure my audience has learned a lot. Thanks for coming on. We should do something like this again, maybe. But
yeah, definitely.
Probably on one certain book and start dissecting into it.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah, I'd love to.
On again later.
Definitely, I'd love to. So awesome. send us all the links and everything when you post it.
Oh,
has this been on Instagram Live?
No, this has been on Zoom. I'm gonna be done. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna be doing some repurposing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.